as you know, now I remember I played football a little bit. So I played football as a PB, then I didn't play it anymore until I got to high school, and then I played it again in high school. And I'll never forget going into the locker room, and I played quarterback for a little bit in high school. And when I did, I remember they were like, well, tell me about like your experience. And this is like the day that I quit playing as a kid. So I didn't play from like that game really until I played again in high school. And so I don't know if you've ever done this before, but I had this one part of my story, and I had multiple parts, but certainly this one part that I just like hid and didn't tell anybody about. I actually, and I don't know if you are like this as well, I can be really good at like talking about things without ever actually talking about the thing. Does anybody else do that? Like you're good at like figuring out how to like hide it if you need to. And I put in my notes and said it this way. This is kind of the unifying factor for most everybody in the room, and that's this. That sometimes we hide parts of our past in an effort to preserve parts of our future. So I just want you to imagine this. Can you imagine getting to high school and you're a sophomore and you're about to start quarterback, all this kind of stuff, and walking into the locker room and looking at everybody like, let me tell you how experienced I am, right? And then you just tell that story, and even if they're nice, every part of them just goes, I have zero confidence in you to lead our team to any sort of anything, right? There's a little bit of that. And so what I immediately did, I just sort of started hiding parts of my past until I sort of proved myself. Now, you can talk about this in a funny sort of like football pee-wee sort of light, but most of us, right, if we're honest, most of us have things in our hearts and our lives that we are very good at sort of like packaging or repackaging and putting away, right? And making sure that nobody sees that sort of thing. And most of us, if we're really honest, are really good at even convincing ourselves or creating narratives in our own mind that make these things that we hide and don't talk about sort of okay, right? Now, when you look at this, it's not even always unhealthy. We shouldn't always talk about everything to every person, for sure. But there's a piece of us that feels shame, and we've talked about this a lot over the last few weeks, feels shame, we put it away, we put it aside, and that sort of thing. And then some of us, and this is the interesting part, some of us do that with certain people as an act to preserve ourselves to be safe with certain other people, right? That you actually hide certain parts of yourself, not even because of shame, but because you're not sure if the person that you're in front of or with, if it's a safe thing to do, right? So what we're going to do for the next few minutes is I told you, we're going to look at my favorite area of the Bible, my favorite narrative of the Bible, and if you've read it before, you know that there's power and beauty in it. If you've never read it before, it actually is sort of nestled in to what's kind of like a famous story in the Old Testament. But the guy that we're going to be looking at today is a guy called Mephibosheth. So we're going to try to say this together, mostly because I like what happens when about 200 people say this at one time. This is always fun. So on the count of three, we're going to say it pretty loud. We'll say it confidently. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, you said that in church too. All right, let's try it one more time, just so we kind of get ready for it. 1, 2, 3. Mephibosheth. Now, I'm not going to make you say that the entire time, but as we talk about this, we're going to call him Mephi because that's more fun for me. So we're going to talk about Mephi today just because I don't want to repeat that over and over and over again with a speech impediment, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Mephi today. Now, to get to know his story, right, a little bit about him, the famous people around him are actually what the story feels like it's about in the beginning. So I'm going to walk you through this. There's a guy named Saul. Saul became sort of king of this nation that was connected to God, and he had blessed this nation. It's just so fascinating. Saul becomes their first king. And in the beginning, it seems like things are going well. But as it progresses, his sin expands to the point where it's almost like God's like, no. This is what you asked for, but we're going to remove him. Like there's a little bit of that. And so God says, and this is where the famous part comes in, that he's not going to be king anymore, but that one day a little guy named David's going to be king. And everybody knows David goes to the Goliath and giant, little rock falls down, all that sort of stuff. But in the midst of that, David leading, right, this group of people, what ends up happening is Saul becomes his enemy. And in the moments where David could have taken him out, in the moments that he could have sort of leveraged his own thing to end it with Saul, he chooses not to do that. But at the end of the day, Saul has been chasing David for a lot of years, chases David for a long time. David ends up sort of like in the wilderness with his like Robin Hood merry men, as Saul's kind of chasing him around. And so really Saul becomes an enemy of David. But Saul has a son. His son's name is Jonathan, who actually became one of David's best friends, which is like the thing that every HBO show is sort of made of. Like this is Game of Thrones-ish, right? You have Saul, who's the king, the leader, who's chasing after David, trying to end David. But yet David's really close to Saul's son, Jonathan. And Jonathan then has a son who's Mephi, right? So here's what happens. And again, you don't need me to tell you this. You know this. In the ancient world, when there's a transition of power like this, what ends up happening with like a guy like Mephibosheth is the new king would come in. And when you come in, you sort of eradicate everybody from the family who you deem as a threat, right? So if you watched it on Game of Thrones or something like that, here's what you also know. Like that kind of thing was happening in the ancient world. So when a new king would come, then what would happen is they come and sort of eradicate. Now what happens is this, that Saul ends up dying in battle. Jonathan ends up dying in battle as well. And so what's left then is what is David going to do with the rest of these people? And so David gets word that Jonathan and Saul both die in battle. And Mephibosheth has a person who's helping him. Like in the midst of this, he's sort of helping him through all of this. But Mephibosheth also had a severe disability as well, right? And so what begins happening is Mephibosheth has this person who's watching him. She's sort of nursing him and making sure that he's okay. She picks up the child. As she picked up the child, he has a permanent injury to both of his legs and again, ends up with a disability. And in the midst of this, the question becomes, what are we going to do with this almost like man, young guy? What are we going to do with this guy who's connected to Saul? And when a new king comes in, essentially you come in and sort of eradicate anybody who could threaten the kingdom. And that's the context of what we're going to look at over these next few minutes. Now, I will say a couple things, a couple caveats. Number one, this isn't obviously how things happen today, so it feels like a distant sort of like war story at times, and I understand that. Second thing is this, and when you think about the context around this, it's hard to feel the weight of it because we would assume that a leader wouldn't do what people assume David might do, but in this sort of area of the world and at the time, this is just the kind of thing that happened at transitions of power. And so what Mephibosheth, or Mephi, would have been feeling throughout this is what's going to happen to me. The people around him sort of curious what's going to happen to him because in customarily sort of way, this is what would have ended Mephibosheth's life, right? And so this is where we're going to pick up, and we're going to look at his story. So here's what it says. The writer picks up here in 2 Samuel chapter 9. So David asks this. He said, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, this is fascinating, not necessarily for Saul's sake, because, Saul was chasing me down trying to kill me, but for Jonathan's sake, what can I do to show kindness to him? And this is an interesting question, again, with everybody even around David going like, this could be a threat to the throne sort of thing. And I love what happens next. Again, there's so many fun names in this, but the next one is even more fun. It says this. Now, there was a servant of Saul's household, and his name was, can we say that together? See, nobody quite knows. It's good. Ziba, right? So Ziba, even more fun to say. There's a servant named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, he says, are you Ziba? Which is just fun. And I love Ziba's response. He's like, at your service, which immediately takes me to like Beauty and the Beast. I don't know why. I was like, I don't know. I just picture him like that. And he comes like, at your service, whatever you want. I know you're the king. You have all the power. You have all the control. And everybody's a little bit scared. Everybody's a little bit like, what's going to happen to me if I'm connected to Saul? Everybody's a little bit anxious. And David's wanting to show kindness on Jonathan's behalf. And so the king asks him, he says this, he says, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Or the kind of kindness that I feel like God's calling me to show to other people, right? And Ziba answered the king and says, there is still a son of Jonathan, and he is lame in both feet. So what David does is he brings him, and he brings him in, right? He calls for Mephibosheth to come to where David is. Now, this is what's so fascinating, and I think this is the part that's easy for us to miss, right? If you're afraid for your life and you're feeling the weight, the anxiousness of what might happen to you because of what you had no control over with Jonathan and Saul, and the king summons you, it's not like the king just summons you and all of a sudden, a limo shows up, and you hop in the limo, then you go. That's not likely what happened. People showed up where Mephi was, likely guards within this context. They show up, knock on the door, and imagine the emotion that you would have felt going like, oh no, they found me. Oh no, this is it. Oh no, this is what happens. You can imagine the emotion that he would have brought to the moment, likely unsure of why the king was calling him to come. And here's what the writer says. He says this. He goes on, he says, when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, he bows down to pay him honor. Now, this is one of those like really beautiful parts of Scripture that's so easy to miss. And so he shows up, and a man, lame in both of his legs, bows before the king in this moment. And what you're expecting, or what he's likely expecting, is this is the moment that thanks so much. This is great. Like this, and now I'm done. Like there's a little bit of that seeming like in the expectation. There's a little bit like this is kind of how it ends. Like there's everything that you think from any HBO, like this is what it feels like. But the immediate response that he gets from David is powerful. He gets, Mephibosheth. Now, with the exclamation point, you could read this in about 1,000 different ways, written like here. Again, now, in the original language, again, what does this look like? But with this sort of moment, however he responds with energy. And it causes Mephibosheth to have the same posture as Ziba, which I love. He says, at your service. Right. At your service. He's going to bow down at your service, right? And David, come on, and you know this, David sensed the fear in him because David knew the context of all of this. David sensed what was happening in this moment. And here's what he says. He says, don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid in this moment. This is not going the way you think. You do not have to be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. Now, it's hard for us to even imagine this, but I want you, as best you can, to think about. He comes with a fear. He bows down. David responds with energy that causes him to go at your service, and then David goes, you don't have to be afraid. And not only do you not have to be afraid, but I'm going to restore back all that was lost to you. The next part is actually even more beautiful than that. It's not that just you're going to get the things that was lost, and not just that you're going to get the things back to you that I'm going to give to you. Then he has this line. He says this. He says, and you will always eat at my table, which is so powerful, right? How many of you grew up in a home where you ate around the dinner table, once a week or so? Anybody ever done this? Right? It's always funny. We were a family that, like, we had the little trays. Remember, like, the dinner TV tray thing? They, like, pop out, and they always, like, hit your shin, but you still use them all the time. But when we'd have people over, my mom would go all out. And so we'd have people over to the house, and for a long time, we had a pretty large dinner table, and we'd bring people over. But not everybody got to do that, right? You almost think of it like this. The church that we used to work at would describe a lot of relationships. Like, there are people that are like, hey, they come into the lobby, like they hang out in the lobby, and they're there, but they never really go past the lobby. You know what I mean? Like, there are people that come to your home, but they, like, lobby. And then there are people that, like, they come to your living room, and you, like, hang out for a night, but you never, like, have a meal together. But there's something different, right, about sitting around a table with somebody else. And there's something different about a home where you come in and you don't just make it to the lobby, you just make it to the living room, you make it all the way to the dinner table to sit with someone else. And you know this about the relationship. There's something about the dinner table that both communicates something about the relationship, but also draws you in sort of deeper. And what David does in this restoring these things back is he restores them back, but then he gives him a seat at the table that Mephibosheth, would not have viewed himself to deserve. And then likely, this is always fun to think about, all the other people around who didn't have a seat at David's table, but were still connected, seeing this moment, and David leans in and restores back to this person, not just everything else, but a seat at the table of the king. And so not only does it speak to his status, but it speaks to who he is in this moment. I put in my notes to say it this way. The proximity to the king in this story established Mephibosheth's status in the entire kingdom. Right? The words that are used about him early, it talks about him being lame. It talks about his disability. Those kind of things. It talks about how disconnected in some ways he was. But here, all of it's restored, and he's connected deeply to the king. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that you could have ended the story. In fact, this is part of the reason I love the Bible is because when you look at it, there are these sections that feel so deeply human that it doesn't feel like a fairy tale. It doesn't feel like a fantasy because of how human it actually feels. Because what he responds with isn't yippee or how much money am I getting back? You know what I mean? Or is it a comfortable chair at the table? Because I've seen your table, bro. Like, it's not that. Or like, what are we eating? It's none of that. He doesn't even assume immediate access. In fact, he goes wildly the other direction. Mephibosheth bows down again and says, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Now, I love this because the imagery around this, how many of you have dogs? Do you have any dog people in the room? Where are my dog people at? Where are my cat people at? Oh, I thought somebody was going to boo. I just wanted to see what would happen. All right, so here's the thing about dogs, and this is gross, and I know that it's gross. But there's something about dogs. So I love dogs. We had a little miniature collie for a long time as I was a kid. I had had a dog when I was in my early 20s in an studio apartment. That was less of a good idea when I was dating Emily. So anyway, there's all that. And so, but we love dogs. But there's something about dogs, especially when they're like young and not trained yet. Have you ever seen this? Where, sorry, I don't know how to say it except for what it is. But when a dog eats just about anything. Am I right? Including its own, you know what I mean? Like, there's a little bit of that. Some of you are like, this was the last time I'm ever coming to your church, but this was fun. But as you look at the imagery in this is so fun. There are scholars that look at this and the specific connection to what he says when it comes to like the dead dog thing. So fascinating. Because the way that he views himself was as this like dead dog, but specifically a dog sort of like eating scraps, you know? Like a person who didn't have access was set aside and put aside. And what happens next isn't David looking at him going, oh, no, Mephibosheth, you're not that. Let me convince you that you're not that. It's not that. And he doesn't come alongside of him with like a Hallmark card and say, no, look, here's what I really wanted to tell you. Let's lean in more. Let's hug. There's none of that, right? David doesn't even respond verbally to what he says about the identity that he's embraced. He didn't even go there. David's response back to him is only with action, as if what David had already said was true about him, whether he viewed it that way or not. Here's what it says, right? Here's what the writer says about this. It goes on, it says, and the king summoned Ziba. Like, he doesn't even stop. This happens. King just summoned Ziba, because, again, Ziba, I don't know, it's fun. Saul's steward, and he said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. Not only what he viewed as owed, but all of this that belonged to him. And then he responds, and he says this. He says, you and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And then he comes back to the thread that speaks so powerfully the identity of who he is now. It says, and Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always, always, always eat at my table. Now, this is kind of one of those moments when I don't even know. Have you ever had one of these moments where it's like it feels like a blur to you? Like you remember parts of it, you don't remember all of it? Like you remember the good part, but you don't remember the whole thing, you know? My gut says this is probably what this was like. You have Mephibosheth here still likely bowed down, talking about the dead dog thing, and David's already moving to align things to give back to him what was lost and re-emphasizing that he has a seat at the table. And then Ziba responds with this, and I love it. He says, your servant will do whatever my lord, the king, commands his servant to do. And I love this. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as if or like he was one of the king's sons. Now, this is one of those things that it feels like a feel-good type story. You know what I mean? I know that. And it feels like a pastor type text, of course, and then you're going to tell us that we just hug everybody at the end of this, and it feels so good. And like it feels equivalent to like a Nicholas Sparks kind of thing. I get it, right? There's a little bit of that. The problem with this, and this is the thing that I think people can miss so quickly with the scriptures, is the level of mess this kind of grace actually creates. It affected Ziba's life. It affected Mephibosheth's life for sure. It affected all the people that were around that would have heard this that didn't have access to the table. It affected David's life for the rest of his life. And it changed the course, but it didn't eliminate any of the mess. And what David does is he opens his table to Mephibosheth, carrying both the joy and the pain that came from the father and grandfather of this man. And he changed his life. Now, the reason that it's not just feel good is to carry any sort of thing like that and to be a person who speaks into that kind of redemption. You both create mess as you live in the redemptive work of Jesus, and you live with some of that mess. You create misunderstanding in the ways that you love people, and that's hard and difficult at times, and not everybody gets or understands that, and that's painful too. When you are a part of the redemptive story of other people, you also know this too, it's never easy, and it's always worth it, but it's never easy. And I think the beauty of what this passage shows us, and then what Jesus comes back years and years and years later and models for people, is what David did for Mephibosheth. Is he comes and he disrupts the pieces of the world and the establishment that would have put people like Mephibosheth to the side. And he comes and he invites people to the table, and he used language like this new kingdom that would be a part of the world. And he invites people to be a part of this new kingdom. And there are people that lean into it, and then people who rejected it, and then people who took a threat to it and ended up killing him, right? You know this. All of these things existed. The beauty, the redemption, the mess, the pain, all of it within the redemptive nature and the redemptive story of what Jesus does. And then, don't miss this. And what Jesus does, and you see this all the time, is he then shows up at the tables of other people. And then what he models for us is how he creates this sort of metaphorical table that everybody gets to come to and sit at. And what's happened over Christianity, you know this, and you've been a part of this before, you've seen this before. And what happens over time is that as this becomes a thing, what you see in the early church is certainly truth and certainly grace, but a deep invitation of people to sit at the table in the new kingdom of Jesus over and over and over again. And he invites and elevates people who it seemed like that would never be the case for. And he shows up, and some of you remember the story. He shows up on a Sabbath and he heals somebody. And the immediate response for some of the Pharisees are like, you can't work on the Sabbath. I mean, because it was so connected to the law, and it was so connected to these sorts of things. And it wasn't that those things didn't exist, but Jesus goes, no, there's more to it. Because that person has a seat at my table. When Jesus dies on the cross, again, one of the most powerful images that we get of this is he turns to somebody next to him who likely deserved to be there when he didn't. And don't miss this. And what he does is it's today you'll be with me in paradise. Giving grace. And come on, you know this. There's a little part of you that thought, but can you just pray right before you die if you do all the bad stuff? You know what I mean? Is it really about a prayer real fast? Like, you know, in Jesus' name, amen, forgive me for all my sins. Whoop, and you're done. Like, because some people would say this, well, then you get to do everything you want to do the whole time. You know what I mean? I don't get to do that, which is fascinating to me. But Jesus looks at him and provides grace for somebody like that on the cross. He came and he died for the people who put nails in his hands or wrists. He came and he died for the person who beat him like a bloody pulp. He came and he died for all of them. And he invites them, and this is the language that we use around here, to an expansive table that doesn't end. This is a beautiful, powerful, expansive table that people have a seat at. Please don't listen. And it creates mess, and it's difficult, and it's hard. And it's absolutely necessary for us. Now, I grew up single parent home, just me and my mom. So a couple things were true about this. When we ate, we usually watched TV with the dinner table, and it was great. I remember the first time I went over to a big family's house, right? Specifically, when I went over to my wife's house. My wife is one of 5 kids. Do we have anybody? Are you one of 11? How big was that table? Like, you know what I mean? Like not big enough. Now, here's what we say about this. This is so good. Right? If you've ever been to somebody's house who has a big family and they have a big dinner table, a couple of things are true, especially if they have middle school students, right? You know, like when you're in that age, it's always messy. Usually there's a dad who's trying to give a life lesson of some sort, and usually it's around why their daughter shouldn't date that guy. You know what I mean? Like, there's a little bit of that. If you have a middle school boy, it just smells bad. You know, it's funny, and it's like it's private gas passing the whole meal. You know what I mean? There's a little bit of that. It's never quite the way that it should be. There's always food around. There's always food on the floor. If you have a dog, you get the dog's involved. You see all of these beautiful things, and it's messy. And if you go to describe this to somebody, like, what's dinner like at your house? And everybody almost presents it like it's so great and so easy. Everybody likes it. If somebody's fighting in the middle of the dinner table. You ever had this? If you have a big family, like Emily's one of 4 sisters, and then they had a boy. They just kept going until they had a boy at the end, you know? And I laugh. I don't get sisters. Does anybody have a sister? Like you're a girl and you have a sister. You get this. I don't get it. That you steal each other's stuff for no reason. I don't understand that. You know what I mean? And then you fight about it at the table. You're wearing her shirt at the table saying, no, I didn't. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of that. Like there's tension involved, you know. It is not this beautiful picture, Thomas Kincaid sort of whatever. It's messy. And then you have people over, and you know this too, you've probably seen this, and a lot of times the mom wants it to feel perfect. You ever seen this? And you invite somebody over, but the kids immediately take that to mean, how can I ruin your entire life? You know what I mean? And so it's not, and it's hard and it's messy. And then you turn like 18, 19, 20, 21, 25, 30, and the tables that you sat at with your family over and over and over again, you know this, it becomes one of the things that you miss the most. And all of its mess. And if you were to describe the mess of it to someone else, it's like, oh gosh, oh God, really? Huh? But you missed that. And when we talk about the new kingdom of Jesus, we like to make it perfectly that it fits everything that feels good. And everybody, this, and everybody has a perspective around what Jesus' new kingdom looks like or should look like or could look like. And a lot of the time it matches what I think Jesus' new kingdom should look like, would look like, could look like. We all have our biases. We all have our pain. We all have our stuff that we bring to it. And Jesus, I feel like, would go, but I died for all of them. And I came for all of you, which means your table should feel like that. The better mind says that we are all invited to the expansive table of Jesus. But I think what the local church is and becomes is groups of people who go, what we're going to do is we're going to come and we're going to answer the calling of building expansive tables of our own. Now, this feels so good. Come on, it's hard to disagree with me so far, and I totally get that. It's hard to, nobody goes, no, I don't want to do that. Nobody does that. Nobody says that. And at the same time, we're good with it until someone shows up to our table that makes us uncomfortable. Or until we simply just don't care about people enough to lean into truth and grace and love. Well, you know this too. Or we have our own fear. But how do I be in a relationship with somebody who's different than me, or sees the world different than me, or communicates different than me, or looks different than me? All of us, and we struggle with that. Now, here's what's so powerful, is there's two forms of this, and don't miss this, and this is where Christianity is so fascinating to me. You get one form of this that says, of course you have everybody to your table, and then you don't have to talk about anything hard, and it becomes a Thomas Kincaid picture, and everybody's loved and accepted. But what that really means is everybody's loved and accepted without any truth involved in that. And so on the other side, what happens is it becomes an expansive table, but that's not what Jesus teaches, nor what Jesus did. Or you have the other side of this, and you see this in churches, where it's so much of the truth side of it that you might invite everybody to your table, but don't miss this, but nobody wants to come. You know what I mean? Nobody, it's not fun. No one likes you. You know what I mean? Like you're just so like, some of you have been to that, some of you sat through those messages, where at the end of it, it's just like, I just feel like I got beat up. Somebody told me one time, this is one of my faces, they're like, I just wish you'd beat me up more. And I was like, look at me. I got sacked for 32 yards, bro. You know what I mean? Like, no, I'm kidding. But you get this, right? There's a little bit of this where you go, and there's these two extremes. One that's so focused on love or grace, but without the part and love and grace that actually speaks the truth. And then the other side of it that's so focused on everybody fitting into whatever, the law side of it, that misses the love, grace, and acceptance. And they miss this. And so the table, so don't miss this, might be full of people who never experienced the transformative work of Jesus, or might be on the other side going, no one wants to come to the table. And neither one of those are the picture of the New Testament church. Please don't miss it. Neither one of those are pictures of the New Testament church. And most of us have a bent. Come on, just transparently. More times than not, I bend a little bit more this direction. Just the way that I see the world, the way that I'm wired, right? I know that about myself. And because of that, I need to make sure that, not that I overcompensate, but that I recognize that, no, I need to see the world through other people's eyes with empathy. Some of you bend this way. And honestly, the other side of this is where culture goes, yes, that's where everybody should be. That's where and you bend this way. And at the end of the day, come on, you need to be able to go, I love people enough to say, no, I want you to experience the life that God has called you to live, that Jesus wants you to live. And I'm not going to be afraid to lean into that. And there's both of these. And somewhere in the middle of this, I think, is where Jesus actually calls people to. And somewhere in the middle of this is where Jesus calls us to live. And come on, and you know this. And somewhere in the middle of it is the thing that every one of us crave existed for us and the people that we loved. And at the end of your life and at the end of my life, you're going to say all the sorts of things about what you talk about, and all the things that you did, and all the ways that you achieved things, and all the hustle that you did, and all the money that you made, and the house that you have, and how great your kids are, and how great, whatever those things are. But at the end of your life, I put it in my notes, I said it this way, at the end of your life, our greatest impact will be determined not simply by how much we know about things, but how expansive our table has become. And come on. And how much you loved people enough to say, I want you here. And not only do I want you here, but I'm going to wade into the mess that an expansive table creates. All right, the system that we build this on here is called dinner parties. I remember as we were dreaming about this, we saw a church in New York that leaned into this. The dinner party thing was so fascinating because what it does is it seats you with people who see the world differently than you do. And it seats you with people, and done over time well, it causes enough of the messiness and tension for you to sit next to somebody who sees the world differently, experiences the world differently, and doesn't agree with you. And you know what the power in that is? You ready? Is it moves you typically from wherever you are, not from like over there. It moves you in a sense to where you go, I see it through another human being's eyes that Jesus came to die on the cross for and experience redemption with. Come on. And these are the tables that we talk about. We can talk about it when it comes to dinner parties, but we can just talk about it with who you spend time with. Come on, if you're really blunt and honest, most of us are really good at building relationships with people who are enough like us. And we're radically not great at building relationships with people who don't see the world as we do. And so here's my challenge for you. This is ingrained in our church. And pridefully, and I will say it, pridefully, people have told me before we were launching, you just can't do that. Which every part of my Enneagram 8 personality is like, watch me. I'm like, here we go. I'm just part of that way. So I'm going to say, that's what we've done. And so when we say it's a place for people with doubts and questions about faith, we mean it. And you will sit next to people who are like that and also sit next to people who feel pretty certain about the things they think, great. My challenge to you as a person who's here, and if you're here in this phase or season of our church, you're a person who's building it whether you meant to or not, right? My challenge to all of us is that we work to expand our table. And all of us have a different way that God's going to call us to do that. All of us. All of us are going to experience this a little bit differently because of our personality and our bent. All of us are going to see this a little bit differently. And hopefully we disagree with each other a little bit. But at the end of the day, right, we are to expand our tables in the ways that Jesus modeled for us. So I put in my notes, these are a couple ways that I work. There's so many things you can say about this. A couple ways I do this. You're going to do it for a few. And this is hard to say. This is just honest. It's hard to take an entire group of people that you're not necessarily connected with and pursue the entire group of people. Do you know what I'm saying? And here's how you can pick up on this when you meet somebody and they have they're like, yeah, I'm trying to do it in this way. And you're like, and it's just like, you can't hang out with 500 people like that. I know, you and I both know you can't. Who are the few people that you can expand your table with that make you slightly uncomfortable? Here's the other one around this. Well, I guess this leans into the second one. I'll tell you the second one. Prioritize relationship over risk. Anytime that you're in a social circle and you take a step outside of what the norm is, there will be people who look at you with slight judgment. Sometimes they're going to say it, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just going to look at you funny, and that's great. But I'm just going to tell you, when you learn to prioritize relationship over risk, you will likely lose a handful or some of the people that are in this part of your circle, but you should lose them anyway. Come on, nobody likes to talk about this, but some people need to be challenged at an ending of a relationship with boundaries that are connected around expansion that push them to a different kind of expansion on their own. And you know this. Come on. You've seen this. You need to prioritize relationship over risk. You need to acknowledge that sometimes people are going to be sarcastic. Sometimes people aren't going to understand. And every part of you, at least if you're wired like me, which everyone obviously is, that was a joke. What you're going to have to remember is I don't have to be understood by everybody. And here's the fun part. You ready? This one's free. Well, all of it's free, but yeah. Second part about this is the other one. And even if I wanted to be, there's no way I would do it, even if I lived in safety of it. There are people who don't agree with you behind your back. You just don't know it, and that's okay. You're fine. They'll be fine too. When you expand your circle, you do for a few, but you prioritize the relationship over risk. And the last one is this, right? I think you serve deeply in proximity to other people, right? Here's what I mean by that, right? The more proximity that people have with you, come on, there's no other way to jump through this hoop. It doesn't happen once a year. It doesn't happen when you just randomly go off to your staff retreat with the people that you're around. Like, it doesn't happen with trust falls once a year. It doesn't do that. What happens is when you decide that I want people to have proximity to me, that I open the door for that, not for everybody, but for the few that I can and move forward with, and expand my table. And if I find myself uncomfortable and struggle through moments of those things, and what begins to happen to you is the parts of you almost get reinforced. Parts of you are more open, and then parts of you, and this is what we talk about a lot, just become so much more curious about the human in front of you. So much more curious about the human in front of you. Our dream for the local church has been and will always be that when you come here, you're in proximity and relationship to other people who Jesus came and he died for. And until you're willing to expand your table to see the humanity in everybody that you come into contact with, you ready? When I give a message around inviting people to church, it's hard for you to think about who you're going to invite because everybody already agrees with you. Everybody already sees the world the way you do. And I'm just telling you, at the end of the day, what God is moving us towards and calling us to is expansive tables. And I put it in my notes and said it this way: that may we always be a church who leaves comfort to pursue other people. May we always be that church. May we always be a church who goes, hey, I might disagree with you theologically. Come on, I hope you do. I'm sure you do. I'd be wildly concerned if you didn't sometimes. And I might even in my heart be doing this at some of the things that I feel or teach or that sort of thing. I get it. But I've never been a part of a more loving and grace-filled church. I've never felt more welcomed at a church. I might wildly disagree, but I've never felt more loved and welcomed, and I've never, because of that, been more challenged to develop the kind of relationship with Jesus that Jesus has called me